Max Weber was, in many ways, the principal architect of modern sociology, and to this day, he's still one of the principal sources of sociological theory and speculation. Like Marx and Engels, he had attempted to create a social science, a science of society that would help explain historical change. But there were some differences between his work and what we found in our discussion of historical materialism. We remember that Marxist historical materialism was informed by an attempt to create Newtonian-type laws of development. Weber, far more affected by the Darwinian revolution, sought to understand society through taxonomic schemes, through classification, the exactly same sort of methodology we would find in, for example, biology. And it was such taxonomic schemes that allowed Weber to engage in what we would call cross-historical analysis, to apply types and models to a variety of different historical, cultural, and social circumstances. Another difference between Weber and Marx was that Marx was concerned primarily, as we saw, with economic structure. And the economy was really critical to Marx's thinking. Weber was interested in economy. The text we look at today, Economy and Society, its title suggests that. But Weber saw the economy and economic influence as one species of a larger genera, and that being power. And Weber was interested in power in all its manifestations. Another difference between them is that Weber sought a value-neutral analysis of sociology, whereas Marx had insisted on that very close relationship between theory and practice, that one's philosophy ought help us change the world. Weber feared that sociology had become, in fact, the sort of handmaid of partisan politics and ideological struggle. So he sought a sociology that would be scientific and would in fact be independent of one's political perspectives. This is not to suggest that Weber did not have political convictions. He did. We would describe them as quite passionately liberal, but he always saw that they were in some sense separable from his sociological work, his work as a theorist of society. What we're going to examine in this lecture is his analysis of a particular kind of power. We might define power as the ability to act, or the ability to force others to act. Within that range of phenomena we might call power, there's a smaller sort of power, which Weber called Herrschaft, which is sometimes translated as legitimate domination, though I think probably more intuitively it's better to understand that as authority. And what characterizes authority is not only that you have the power to force action, but that such power is recognized as legitimate by those it is subject to. So authority is that situation in which an authority's commands are recognized by those subject to it as both legitimate and therefore in some sense moral. Weber in fact defines domination as the probability that certain specific commands, or all commands, will be obeyed by a given group of persons. Okay. So what we're going to do in this lecture is first look at what Weber means by legitimate domination or authority and what's entailed in the analysis of it. And you'll see that, in fact, Weber argues that in all of human history we found exactly 3 forms of authority or legitimate domination. And then we will spend some time looking at each of those 3 forms of domination or authority. First, legal or bureaucratic authority, then traditional or patriarchal patrimonial authority, and then finally, charismatic authority. Okay. So let's begin with our analysis of authority in general, or legitimate domination. Now, there are a variety of, as we've seen, of different ways of supporting such domination. Custom, personal material interest, and even a desire for solidarity all help support authority. But ultimately, the only thing that is sufficient to support authority is the belief in the legitimacy of that given form of authority and the persons who are empowered within it. And if we think about authority or legitimate domination, it is essentially the rule over a considerable number of persons and requires a staff. Thus, it's ultimately a three-place relation between, on the one hand, a ruler, on the other, his or her staff, and finally, subjects, those subject to that authority. As the type of authority or legitimate domination varies, so does the kind of administrative staff we would find, the type of obedience, and the mode of exercising authority. Thus, types of domination are classified according to their claim to legitimacy. And as we'll see, claims to legitimacy are based on three different grounds. There are rational grounds, those associated with bureaucratic authority. These rest on a belief in the legality of enacted rules and the right of those elevated to authority under such rules to issue commands. And Weber calls this the essence of legal authority. A second ground of authority might be tradition. We might speak of traditional grounds of authority. And these rest on the belief in the sanctity of immemorial traditions and the legitimacy of those exercising authority under them because of their traditional place in a social, political, or institutional hierarchy. And that's sort of the essence of traditional authority. And finally, there are charismatic grounds for authority. Charismatic authority rests ultimately on a devotion to either the exceptional sanctity, heroism, or the exemplary character of an individual, and the normative patterns or order revealed by that individual. And that's what we mean by charismatic authority. Now, it's important to note that these three forms are, in fact, archetypes, right? They are pure models. They are not to be found always in their pure form. Also, it's important to note that they're not in any sense mutually exclusive, which means that they can range over all kinds of organizations and institutions. For example, the family, private social clubs, political parties, the institutions of the state, legal courts, military organizations are all subject to each of these pure forms of authority, and often we'll mix them. So we'll find mixed modes of authority as well. Okay. Well, let's turn to that first form of authority, legal authority. Legal authority has as a staff a bureaucratic administration. And it is, in fact, the pure type of legal domination, as opposed to a collegial staff, which occasionally occurs in legal domination, but is not really the pure archetype. Okay, so let's look at this pure archetype of legal bureaucratic government or authority. This pure type of authority rests on essentially 5 basic beliefs. First, any legal norm can be established by agreement or imposition on the basis of expediency or morality, and at least the members of the organization, i.e. the bureaucratic staff, must obey. Secondly, every body of law is conceived to be a consistent system of abstract rules, which have been intentionally created, formally created, to be consistent. Third, even officials within the staff are subject to those universal legal norms. Everyone is subject to the rules established by legal authority. No one is above the law, as it were. Fourth, a person who obeys authority does so as a member of the organization. And what is obeyed is not a superior, but the law. And fifth, members of bureaucratic organizations obey superiors solely as placeholders in an impersonal order. It's not based on personal loyalties, but rather on a clear hierarchical chain of command and one's position within it. Such authority is characterized by continuous rule-bound conduct. There are always rules laid out that establish procedures. Specified spheres of conduct. Each bureaucratic official knows exactly what domain his authority ranges over. As I've mentioned, a hierarchic officialdom, where one knows exactly one stands in an organizational chart. Specialized training for officials. Different officials will require different technical expertise. Of course, particularly in private organizations, a sharp disjuncture between the staff and the ownership. And with that, the implication that the staff will be compensated by salaries. And that is what creates a career orientation among the bureaucratic staff. And finally, and incredibly important, that all orders must be written so that they can again be universal, impersonal, and rational. Weber believed that such pure bureaucratic administration was what he called monocratic, meaning that it follows essentially one rule. And in his view, it was in fact the most technically efficient means and therefore formally most rational means of exercising authority over people. It is a sort of species of domination through knowledge. We would find this pure type of authority in a wide variety of institutions. For example, most corporations, from CEO on down, are bureaucratic institutions with clear chains of command, written procedures and rules, career orientation, and technical training. So are most hospitals, run by administrators with clear rules of admission, dismission, and treatment. Schools are largely run bureaucratically, again, based on written rules, curricula, etc. Most priests in churches, in most Christian churches, are in fact part of a bureaucratic organization who must undergo technical training to qualify for the positions that they achieve. Especially this is true since such offices are no longer capable of being appropriated or owned as a sort of fief. Political parties in contemporary America are bureaucratic organizations, the RNC and DNC, both of which have clear hierarchies of command, both of which have procedural rules, and both of which the staff achieve careers through technical expertise. Indeed, even modern armies have become, in large part, bureaucratic organizations, as reflected by the role of staff sergeants at the lower levels, and of course, chief of staff at the higher levels, and staff officers. Weber argues that such bureaucratic domination tends to produce three distinct social consequences. One is, within the bureaucracy, there is a tendency to promote what he called social leveling, a leveling in favor of technical competence. And what this means is that one's social status prior to entry to that bureaucratic structure is in fact irrelevant to one's career orientation within it. That as long as one has the technical training and expertise to do the job, one finds that one has very, very little in the way of one's career advancement. This was critical in the late 19th and early 20th century because both Europe and America were ethnically and racially divided societies. And class differences had been, in fact, profoundly important in identifying status privileges. Bureaucracy tended to undermine that. Any ethnicity and any race could find a position in civil service if it had the technical training and competence necessary to fulfill their office. A second effect of, or consequence of such bureaucratic domination, one that Weber thought was very troubling, was a tendency towards plutocracy on behalf of bureaucratic officialdom, specifically in elongating that technical training necessary for such bureaucratic positions. Which is to say, Weber had a fairly clear insight that not only if you increase the amount of technical training necessary to hold a certain civil service position, that meant A, you enclosed it to a fewer and fewer number of applicants and made it therefore more prestigious. But secondly, this was a great social prerogative for the bureaucrat themselves. Weber realized that it is in fact much more pleasurable to be a university student than it is to work a 9-to-5 job. And the more university training one could demand for such a bureaucratic position, that would essentially become a perquisite for those bureaucratic officials. Finally, the third consequence or result of bureaucratic authority is what he believed the emergence of a cold, formalistic spirit of impersonality. Now, no doubt none of you have ever experienced this in dealing with bureaucracies, that they can be impersonal and somewhat formal and cold, but Weber was really concerned about that. He thought that, in fact, over time, bureaucracies would tend to become less and less human in their responses to their interactions with society as a whole. So that sort of characterizes for Weber what is sort of the overall structure of bureaucratic or legal authority. I want now to turn to that second mode of authority, traditional authority. In this case, the ruler is not a superior in a chain of command. He's rather a personal master. The staff, the second part of that relation, is not made up of specially trained officials, but instead is made up of personal retainers who are ruled as either comrades or subjects, but never as members of the organization. So it's personal loyalty that binds the staff to the master. And obedience, then, is not to some set of abstract rules, laws, or norms, not to some written set of procedures, but rather to a person who holds a position of authority by tradition. We might think of an inherited monarch as such an example, an aristocrat with his retainers. Now, in fact, this form of authority limits the actions of the master, precisely because the master's actions are themselves bound by tradition. And his power must be exercised with an awareness of such constrictions, lest he foment what are known as traditionalist revolutions. Therefore, if a traditional ruler tries to create reforms or reform an administration, he is likely to spark a traditional revolution, a revolution against him on behalf of tradition. And indeed, if we look at the onset of the English Civil War, Parliament claimed to be standing for traditional liberties, fighting against the king to defend the monarchy against the innovations of his ministry. And presumably such an argument might have even been proffered by the French aristocrats involved in the Fronde at about the same time. So in such a case of traditional authority, the creation of law by legislation is out of place. It's not even a conceivable option. For only the good old ways bear legitimacy, not illegitimacy. And again, one might think of this in 17th century England in the famous fascination with the common law and ancient constitution. The notion that the origin of all legal norms and all constitutional norms was from time immemorial, and that those who created innovations were guilty of destroying that foundation. The staff of the ruler in traditional authority is recruited either patrimonially or extra-patrimonially. Patrimonial recruitment is done from persons who owe the chief traditional ties of loyalty. For example, kinsmen, family relations, slaves, household officials or retainers. The Sultan of Egypt used his physician. The leaders of Ottoman Turkey often used eunuchs. It might include clients or freedmen. For example, Roman emperors, very often used as their chief counselors, either slaves or recent freedmen, those who owed their social position, their liberty as it were, directly to a personal master. On the other hand, extra-patrimonial recruitment would include personal favorites. They might be vassals or freemen who voluntarily choose to become officials. One might think of a king who has a favorite in his court and uses him as his prime counselor. Such was the case with Charles I and James I and George Villiers, who would become the Duke of Buckingham. It's this last group, freedmen who voluntarily choose to become officials, who often become the source of the growth of bureaucracy and rational administration. In traditional rule, in contrast to bureaucratic rule, jurisdictions often overlap. And it's the master or lord who adjudicates such issues. And this works to the traditional authority's benefit. If two officials are placed in charge of the same project and one works better than the other, it is the more favorable result, which is then embraced by the traditional authority as reflecting his goals. In such a case, rational or technical training for the staff is simply out of the question. We might think of gerontocracy, or primary patriarchy, the rule of elder males within the family, as forms of traditional authority without a personal staff. An example is the normal patriarchal household, where the absence of a staff means the members are not fully subjects or to some extent members. Again, another example of traditional authority is estate domination, where patrimonial domination is over a staff which appropriates particular powers and assets. Right? So in that case, the Lord's discretion is limited in the choice of staff. There's a certain number of figures that he must draw from to find his staff. And in that case, staff members appropriate positions and their incomes and material means of administration, as well as their governing power. We might think of the feudal knight, who supplied his own armor and troops, and usually demanded not only a benefice, but a fief. Such patrimonial retainers receive support from roughly 5 different possible sources. A knight can receive such support from the Lord's table, simply live with the Lord in his castle and eat with him. He might receive allowances from the Lord's magazine, from his warehouse of goods. He might receive service land, as was the case with boyars and Eastern European nobility. He might receive the appropriation of taxes, fees, or property income. And finally, and this one is critical, he might actually receive a fief, which is a service land which becomes inheritable and therefore the basis of private property. Forms 2 through 4 are all benefices. And when a staff is in principle supported by benefices, it is what we call prebendal. The 5th form, the fief, is what is in fact most rare, and in fact is unique to feudal Europe, Western and Northwestern Europe, and Japan. What are the consequences of traditional authority? The one that Weber found most important was that it tended to strengthen traditional attitudes, specifically towards economic action. We might think of this as a sort of noblesse oblige that undermines formal rationality and thus inhibits capitalism. Okay, so that's our notion of traditional authority. Let's turn now to that third and final form, charismatic authority. Pure charismatic authorities are usually accorded superhuman, supernatural, or at least exceptional powers and qualities. We might think of this in primitive conditions with figures that claim to have magical powers, like shamans, prophets, in military situations, berserkers like Achilles in the Iliad, and other sorts of warrior heroes. In our own day, we think of certain political demagogues who seem to us superhuman and extraordinary, beyond worldly. Those subject to charismatic authority are duty-bound to recognize its authenticity and respond with complete personal devotion to its possessor. And in fact, the origin of the phrase charisma as a source of authority had in fact referred to Jesus and his apostles, who had clearly had religious charisma and had, at least in their own eyes, had supernatural powers. Well, we refer to an organized group which is subject to charismatic authority as a charismatic community. It is the very antithesis of a traditional staff. The prophet has his disciples, the warlord has his bodyguards, and the leader has his agents. Such figures are never appointed. They're not promoted. They're not fired. They don't really have careers. They're not recruited. Rather, they respond to a call by the leader, on the basis of his and their own charismatic qualifications. Jesus sees Simon and says, "Simon, come with me. I will make you a fisher of men." He sees in Simon a certain charisma, a certain religious intensity. Peter, or Simon, who will become Peter, recognizes that in Jesus and follows him. Within such a community, like the community of the apostles, there is no hierarchy. It lives in communistic relations with the leader and one another. Again, we think of the apostolic community, which, according to Acts of Apostles, lived by the credo that Marx would embrace for communism: from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. The means of such a community are supplied by voluntary gift or booty, by anything which is, in fact, extra-rational. And this is necessary to highlight the otherworldly nature of charismatic authority, that it's not supported by rational or traditional means of labor. Charismatic authorities are constantly making new judgments, and such judgments are done on a case-by-case basis. These judgments are considered either divine revelations or divine judgments. So charismatic figures, and this is critical, always demand or preach new obligations. Right? They are the force of change in traditional epochs that demand new moral values, new mores. And the recognition of such values and judgments is a duty for those that feel themselves to be charismatically qualified. They are duty-bound to follow such new moral orders. Now, charismatic authority opposes both rational and traditional authority. With regards to traditional authority, it rejects the normative appeal to the past. And in that sense, in traditional epochs, it is really revolutionary. In fact, it is the revolutionary force in traditional epochs. It rejects past authorities because charismatic figures, as I've mentioned, always preach new obligations. As Jesus says, "I know it is written that, but I say." Okay. The only basis for legitimacy of a charismatic figure is his or her personal charisma, and that lasts as long as it is substantiated by either miracles or some equivalent. And again, one could think of Joan of Arc, whose charisma was based on the fact that she actually was able to lead the French in victories against the English, something which had not previously occurred. Charismatic authority also opposes either traditional or rational economizing. It rejects a regular form of income or employment because it is otherworldly. The problem with charismatic authority is that it is by nature inherently unstable and becomes either traditionalized or rationalized or both. And this is a result of the followers' either ideal or material interests in the movement, usually following after the death of the leader. Such routinization of the charismatic demands of that leader takes one of basically 6 different forms. We might, for example, find replacements by searching for required qualities in a potential new charismatic figure. That's done with, for example, the Dalai Lama. Right? They interview a variety of children and ask them to make certain choices and feel that that child which makes the correct choices does in fact have the qualifications for that charismatic position. They might look for a revelation of who are the legitimate charismatic authorities by means of oracles or lots or various tests of chance. The old leader might choose a new charismatic authority. This is exactly what Muhammad did in picking the caliph to follow him. There might be designation of a new charismatic authority by a charismatically qualified staff and a recognition by the community, which might in fact require unanimity. There are cases of hereditary charisma. For example, primogeniture in medieval Europe tended to argue for as long as knights that were warrior aristocrats, essentially berserkers, the notion was that primogeniture would ensure that charisma followed in the family. And then finally, the most routinized form of charisma is office charisma, where it's in fact the office that holds the charisma, and once one is initiated in it and hands are laid on that official, then one's, all of a sudden, by entering that office, takes on the charisma of it. Okay. Finally, I want to conclude with this thought of Weber, that charismatic authority can be transformed in a democratic direction. In such circumstances, public recognition is not the result of legitimacy, but rather its basis. We might think of this as the democratic legitimacy, which underlines the notion of a ruler whose charisma comes from the people.